I am Lori Esposito Murray, President of the Committee for Economic Development, the Public Policy Center of the Conference Board. And welcome to CED's Leadership in Challenging Times series, where we feature the outstanding business leaders who are recipients of the CED Distinguished Leadership Awards. This year's CED is paying special tribute to business leaders and their company teams who have helped our nation navigate the many challenges before us, including the pandemic, an economic recovery that provides equal opportunity for all Americans, building a more civil and just society, and upholding a rules-based international order. And today, I have the privilege of speaking with our 2022 honoree, Chris Kempczinski, President and CEO of McDonald's Corporation, which is a standout in all of those areas. McDonald's, as you all know, is the most recognizable leading food service brands in the world, with more than 36,000 restaurants in 120 countries. And here at home, McDonald's and its franchises collectively amount to one of the largest US private employers, with around 800,000 people working in their domestic restaurants. Chris and the McDonald's team have demonstrated outstanding leadership in bringing its corporate purpose to feed and foster the community to life. Welcome, Chris.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you today.
Well, thank you. So let's get started. You became CEO just months before the outbreak of the pandemic, and you were faced with this daunting and unprecedented challenge. What were the principal leadership tools you drew on, and what are the most important lessons you are taking forward?
Yeah, it was a little bit unnerving. I'd say at the time, actually, I didn't fully appreciate what we were dealing with. I felt like in the beginning that this was going to be another regional outbreak similar to SARS or MERS or swine flu, some of the other things that we've dealt with. And it wasn't until probably we saw that COVID was showing up in Europe, particularly in Italy, that the light bulb for me went on and said, this is a global pandemic. And that was probably around February of 2020. And so, as you would imagine, in a system like ours, where you have not just the company people, but you have a network of suppliers, you have a network of franchisees, you get bombarded with a lot of questions that come in from everybody around the world. And one of the things that I tried to do in the very beginning was to just outline some principles of how we were going to look at it. So I don't have all the answers. I'm not sure where this is going to go, but I am going to outline for everybody some principles about how we're going to approach these issues. And so I talked about one of the things that we were going to do is that we were going to make sure that we prioritized the safety of our people and customers. So that was kind of the starting point. The second thing we talked about is we're going to be transparent with everybody about what we do know and what we don't know at the time. We talked about the fact that we were going to lean into the fact that we don't just run close to 40,000 restaurants, but we run close to 40,000 community centers, and that we had a role to play in the community. And so we were going to lean into our value with that. And I also said something that I found later was particularly helpful. The system needed to hear this, but I said nobody is going to fail in the system here, is going to go out of business because of COVID. So if you're a franchisee, if you're a supplier, I'm making a personal commitment to you. You will not go out of business due to COVID. McDonald's will backstop you to whatever it takes to get you through this pandemic. And the positive about doing that when we did it, again, this was now, I taped that message, I think it was in early March, is it got everybody out of thinking short term, and we could start thinking a little bit longer term. When you're in the short term crisis of, is my business going to be here or not, you might make some decisions that probably aren't in the best interest. But if you have the assurance that hey, 5 years from now, I know I'm still going to be part of this McDonald's system, I know I'm still going to be in business, you're able to think through things, I think, in a more rational and constructive longer term way. And so that was what I laid out in the beginning. And what we then did periodically after that is we just gave progress reports. And there were a lot of things that we didn't have answers to, like, for example, are we going to do layoffs or not? That was a question I got early on in all of this, and at the time, my answer was, hey, not now, but we have to see how this is going to evolve. And fortunately for us, we actually got through COVID in a remarkably strong way. And for us, in many cases, I think it has made our business even stronger. But for us, the key in the beginning was to provide a framework, to provide some principles, and then go from there.
That's so interesting. And so many of those principles seem so relevant to the waters we'll be navigating in terms of where the economy is going over the next several months and years. And it's also interesting that you were backstopping the McDonald's franchises and businesses even before the federal government stood up and provided the same type of support. That's really fascinating. And so, getting to corporate purpose and culture, McDonald's corporate purpose throughout a 60-year history has been to feed and foster the community, as I had mentioned up top. And what I'm really interested in hearing you share with us, your mission is to bring that to life. How do you actually bring that mission to life? And how do you instill those values into such a vast company with franchises around the globe?
For someone like me, the company didn't start with Chris Kempczinski. The company started in 1955 with Ray Kroc. And so in my case, what I try to do is make sure that I understand the legacy of the company and that I'm building on what got McDonald's to be McDonald's, because that's been the successful model. Ray Kroc's idea very early on was that this business was going to operate much better with local franchisees who were embedded in the community, who could connect with little league teams and school boards and city councils and stuff like that. That was going to be far more powerful than trying to manage all of these restaurants in all these countries out of one central location like Chicago. So that whole idea of being very much built in the community, focused in the community, was Ray Kroc's inspiration. And over the years, we've had so many great stories of how our McDonald's franchisees have brought that to life in their local communities. What I tried to do is to put maybe just a little bit tighter definition about where were we going to lean in, and where were we going to try to make a significant difference. One of the things that I think had happened over the years is when it was defined very broadly about we're going to be there for communities, it was sort of taken to be whatever someone wanted to go do with that. So it could be, I'm going to go support a Little League sports team, but I could also be, I'm going to be supporting a local farmer, or I'm going to be doing on and on and on and on and on. So what I try to do is provide a little bit better definition of when we talk about being there for communities, what exactly do we mean? And we ended up with a few areas that we said, this is what we mean by this. So we mean, for example, that we're going to be there to support local farmers who are providing the food that we use in our restaurants. That was one thing that we said we're going to do. We're going to focus on creating jobs and opportunities in the communities where we operate because of our workforce. We have 2 million people that work in our restaurants. We think creating jobs and opportunity by working with local academic and community colleges, that was a second area for us. The third is that we were going to focus on how do we help communities when they're in crisis. And that dates back to our program with Ronald McDonald House. We run 350 Ronald McDonald Houses around the world that provide basically free accommodations as well as social services to families who have children and sick children in the hospital. So we have a history of being there for communities in crisis that also shows up around hurricanes, natural disasters, things like that. So we were gonna go even deeper in partnerships around communities in crisis. And then the last thing is, because of what we, I think, uniquely face at this time in our history as a company, but also as a global community, we were going to lean even harder into the planet and into environmental responsibility, because of the severity of that issue and the fact that we do think we have an opportunity. So we got very tight in saying, let's focus on these. What it meant is we're going to drop all the sports sponsorships. We're not going to be doing all of the food bank work. Not that the food bank work isn't important, but we have to be more focused for ourselves about where do we want to put all of our energy so that we can make an even bigger impact. And that's been what I've been doing over the last 3 years with our system. And it's gone, I think, very well. It's given us a better sense of actually being able to measure progress. When you're doing 100 different things, it's difficult to measure progress. When you're doing 4 things, it's been a little bit easier to measure progress.
That's really interesting, and it also gets to this issue of how stakeholder capitalism is evolving and is becoming even more important in terms of capitalism, business, the economy, and so on that issue, you have a little bit more of a complicated stakeholder group, given the fact that you run these franchises as well. And so how do you manage the competing demands of these various stakeholders?
I think the first thing to recognize is the vastness of the system and the breadth of different perspectives. And I often say, whatever's going on in society is going on in McDonald's, because McDonald's, whether it's in our restaurants or in our organization or our system, we reflect society at large, and we see, I'd like to think, the very best of society that happens, but sometimes we see what other issues that are going on in society as well, and whether that's the opioid epidemic or other things, crime, challenges there, that also shows up in our system. So we see everything. And my view on where we go with this is it's what I've talked about with our board is there's kind of 3 levels of where we weigh in. So the first thing is, if it's directly related to our company or our industry, absolutely we're going to go weigh in those areas. Next level down would be if it goes back to those four areas that I talked about, working with local farmers, creating jobs and opportunity, helping communities in crisis, and then being there on environmental issues, particularly around carbon emissions. Those are 4 areas that we will take policy positions on and advocate, because we've said our definition of being a community leader is in those 4 areas. And then the 5th one is, or the third layer of the cake, if you will, is our 5 values. And we have 5 values as a company that go back to when Ray Kroc founded this company. It was, we put our people and customers first. We open our doors for everyone. We do the right thing. We're good neighbors, and we get better together. Those were essentially the 5 values that Ray Kroc laid out. And we do look at, is there an issue that goes to one of those 5 values that we maybe need to make a point of view on, make our point of view known on, and where we think we can make a difference. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense for me to weigh in on something where I'm not actually going to be able to make a meaningful difference on this. And it was this last area, this point about values, that informed ultimately our thinking around Russia. And it was a fascinating conversation that we had within our company for many months. Because on the one hand, I had people that were in the company who said, Chris, we have 62,000 employees at Russia. These are families that have been with us for many years in most cases. We're in 850 communities in Russia. Don't we have a responsibility? Don't we have an obligation to them and taking care of them for all that they've done for the system? And then you had a different part of the organization saying, the money that we're making, the tax revenues that are coming off of our restaurants are going to support the war in Ukraine, and that's not right, and we have to go do, we have to exit for that reason. So for me, the power of this is, values inherently can get to be a little bit, people can contort it to whatever sort of their agenda is, but it's the conversation that it prompted for us. and ultimately it led to us making weighing in on a topic area that we did think we could make a difference on. There have been other ones that we haven't weighed in on. So that, in a broad sense, is how we think about it, directly related to our business, one of our 4 community areas, or if it's something that touches on one of our values where we think we can actually make a difference in the outcome, that's when we'll weigh in.
So I'd like to stay on the global footprint and the global role of McDonald's and the war in Ukraine and Russia, your decisions in Russia and in Ukraine. What's really fascinating is that in 1990, when McDonald's opened up its first restaurant in the Soviet Union, it was a symbol. It became an iconic symbol of peace in a globalized economy. And the great takeaway phrase was that no 2 countries with McDonald's have gone to war. Your principles and your values were screaming through your decision to actually leave Russia. And it's interesting to hear how the values played on both sides of that decision. You've also just made the decision to go back into Ukraine and reopen in Ukraine. Do you think McDonald's decisions in both those areas is actually takes on a more significant symbol of what's happening in the world and where we're heading into this next phase of deglobalization?
I think there's maybe some aspect to it. And let me maybe explain why. One of the things that's been fascinating to me about being here at McDonald's and the role that I am as CEO is McDonald's is a great vehicle or mechanism to explain what's going on in the world that everybody understands. I mean, no matter where you go in the world, people know what a McDonald's is. They can understand issues through the lens of talking about it like a corporation like McDonald's is trying to navigate it. And so I do think that also because we are viewed as sort of an American icon, we become, in many cases, sort of a proxy for what is the American, soft power. How are we thinking about these various issues? Where do we go? So those two things come together. Everybody sort of understands McDonald's. They can understand the issues as explained through McDonald's, and as an American institution. In many cases, we I think do have an outsized influence as people try to think about what American business is doing. So I think there is some truth to that, and in many cases that's a good thing. In some cases, I would say I would be happy to let others take on that mantle of leadership, because ultimately at the end of the day, we're trying to sell burgers and French fries. We need policymakers, governments to actually solve some of these bigger issues that are out there. We have a role to play, but by no means is McDonald's going to be able to singularly, or business as itself is going to be able to singularly solve these things.
So my final question is, what do you see as the most important challenges ahead as a business leader in terms of McDonald's role, your role, and how do you plan for it?
It's interesting. There are some of the macro exogenous risks that are out there that I think affect every business. Climate change is one that I think is very significant. When you think about also geopolitical risk, that's another very significant one out there that affects every business. I would say if you get a little bit more dialed into our business and a little bit more specific to what are we trying to navigate, there's probably a few areas. The first is just around the continued explosion of digital, and our business is becoming more and more digital. If you go back a few years ago, probably I'd say less than 10% of our transactions were a digital transaction, meaning that I knew it was Lori Murray who bought XYZ at McDonald's, and I could bring that forward to a future purchase. We now have countries like China, like many parts of Europe, where over 50% of our transactions are digital transactions, which means I'm actually learning a lot more about who the customer is, what their preferences are, what their price elasticities are, et cetera. And thinking about how do you use that information to provide a better experience, to provide a better service, but also be very respectful to privacy concerns and also the risk that comes with cyber risk and the potential for that information to get into the wrong hands. So that's one thing that the world has moved so rapidly, so quickly on this whole idea of digital, and everything now is through the phone. It's incredibly exciting, but it also carries with it some new risks. So that's one area that we're spending some time thinking about. I think the second thing for me is about the workforce and how are we continuing to both be attractive to today's employees, but also how do we think about what career planning looks like? And when I began my career, it was more common that you might come into a company like McDonald's and you would spend, the entirety of your career here. And you don't see that as much anymore. And you also see different expectations from employees about what they're looking from their employer. And so what is that relationship between a corporation and its employees? How do we provide something that's still compelling but also moves our business forward? I think that's another area that is changing and we'll have to think more about. And then I think for me, the last thing is just as we think about the company, this distinction between our corporate brand and our consumer-facing brand. In the past, they were kind of separate. People didn't worry about the corporation. The corporation was sort of this nebulous thing over there, and then there was the consumer brand, and you could almost have the two living in very distinct universes. These days, they're two sides of the same coin. The corporate brand and the consumer brand, particularly when they share the same name, like McDonald's, it's tough to separate. And so thinking about some of these topics that you talked about, ESG issues, geopolitical issues, where does the company weigh in? How does it think about these things? What is the potential risk and opportunities to the consumer-facing brand? That's, I think, another big area that I outlined a framework that we're using, but I by no means would say that framework cracks the code. It's just the best one I've got at the moment, but we're going to need to continue to evolve it, I think, over time.
Well, all very interesting, fascinating, and very insightful. So, Chris, thank you for joining us. I was also going to say, if I'm your data point on your menu, and I know you were simplifying your menu, I'd be really easy for you as the Egg McMuffin. That's all you would need.
All right, fantastic. Well, that would be a very good menu to have if we could sell just Egg McMuffins.
So, want to thank you for the leadership role you're playing, not only in the United States with the many employees that you have, as well as globally. It's a privilege to be honoring you this year. We look forward to October.
Thank you, Lori. Appreciate it.